I'm Tom from Do-It-Yourself Home Automation, and this is a look at how to pollinate tomatoes in your Aerogarden. So this is my Aerogarden hydroponic garden, and I'm growing 6 tomato plants in here. This is, I think, the harvest model. And you can see as I reach a certain size, ideally you're going to start to see this up here. These are little flowers on the plant. And if you want it to actually grow tomatoes, instead of just growing a bunch of leaves and little flowers, you actually have to pollinate those flowers yourself. And the good news is that tomato plants are self-pollinating, so you don't have to actually move pollen from one flower to the others. The flower actually has everything that it needs in itself to self-pollinate. But the bad news is that you have to actually help it along a little bit more than you would need to if this was out in a natural garden. And the reason for that is that in a garden, there would be pollinators like bugs and butterflies and that kind of thing going from flower to flower. They would easily just transfer the pollen within the flower when they went in there. Even wind is usually enough to pollinate a tomato plant. So even if there's no pollinators in your outdoor garden, as long as there's a little bit of air movement and wind, then you're probably going to end up with fertilized flowers, and they will be pollinated. And again, that's necessary because the flowers ultimately turn into the fruit. You can see the fruit does grow in there. There's one that's almost ready to pick. So this is the stage where you start to get the flowers, and there's a couple of different ways that you can go about pollinating these yourself. The simplest is just to grab the plant and give it a little shake. And it's hard to see from here, but when you look in reality, you can look at the flower and see little pollen granules. Sometimes you can actually see them kind of burst out of the flower and move around when you do that. And I just like to give them a solid shake, nothing, enough to damage the plant, but enough so that they are shaking like that about once a day. And that's usually enough to pollinate the flowers. And that's a good method. Again, the proof is in the fruit here. Another method is to set up a fan for a couple hours a day near your Aerogarden. Again, that simulates the wind. I'm going to experiment with that ultimately with a cryptocurrency mining computer and using some of the waste air and heat from that. But in the meantime, I've just been using that shaking method. And then the final method, which is actually kind of a neat one, I think, and good if you're using this with kids, is what Aerogarden calls to be the bee, which means you actually get a little tool and you pretend almost to be a bee and go around and pollinate each of the flowers. And I think they actually sell a Be the Bee tool that kind of, it's a little piece of yellow plastic and looks like a little honeybee. I'm going to use a toothbrush. This is actually something that they recommend. You can use a toothbrush, and ideally you can even use a small electric toothbrush so you get some oscillation and vibration, and that'll even help to spread the pollen. But even just with this, very light bristles, just tapping these flowers and spreading some of the pollen on each of them. So just, again, being the bee, simulating what a bee would do, kind of just very gently getting into the flower and just distributing its pollen around. So 3 methods: shaking, easiest one, seems to work fine for me, a fan or some other movement of the air, or being the bee with a toothbrush or Aerogarden's tool. If you do this correctly, then these flowers will turn into fruit, and ultimately you'll get tomatoes like this. If you found this helpful in any way, please subscribe to my channel. It really helps.